Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to episode 19 of Lean Whiskey. I'm Mark Graban. I'm in California. It's daytime, and we're joined by a special co-host today. Different circumstances. I'll let you give the rundown. Who and
Sure.
where and what time of day.
My name is Cliff, and I'm based out of Stockholm, Sweden. And it is probably a more appropriate time for drinking whiskey at 21 minutes past 9 p.m. And it's actually quite nice and warm this side of the world. So I don't know. It's a good time to be drinking whiskey. I'm looking forward to hanging out and having a catch up.
Yeah,
Yeah,
well, that's what the podcast is all about. You
yeah.
probably still have some daylight.
A little bit. We're getting kind of late in the summer now, so we're sort of getting into the autumn and leaves starting to go. Autumn and the fall. That's one of the American names I quite like. Fall. It makes so much more sense than autumn.
Well,
Uh,
yeah.
yeah, I mean the leaves fall. It's pretty straightforward. But we're still a little bit of light, but it's definitely getting more dark now. We lose roughly half an hour of light per week. Uh,
Wow. Okay.
so. Yeah, but it was, sunset was at 11:30 a few weeks ago. So, yeah,
Yeah.
we've had enough sun for a while.
Yeah, that's the opposite. The one time I've been to Stockholm was January or February. So that was the other
Mhm.
extreme of the very short, dim day.
Yeah,
The one opportunity I had to go to Helsinki was the end of May. So that was quite the other extreme. So I
yeah,
hopefully someday get back to Stockholm in the summertime.
yeah. We could film another episode and drink some whiskey in person. That would be
Yeah.
nice. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
So before we learn more about your background and what you're doing, one thing I always do when we have a guest host is kind of chat about, well, where did we drink whiskey and talk about lean or related things in person? Because that's really the criteria for being a
yeah.
guest host over the internet. Have we done something like this together in person? Do you want to introduce that
Sure.
how and
Um,
where we met up story?
so you may have to fill in some details because my memory, what I find interesting is when you tell the story, our memories probably differ ever so slightly. But
Well, piece it.
um, Yeah. So we were in Austin, Texas, actually.
Yes.
I was out there for the Lean Summit or Lean Coaching Summit, I think it was called. I've actually done a couple of different Lean conferences, mostly talking about my experiences because I spent about 4.5 years working at Spotify during some of the rapid growth stages. And we were talking about a couple of things, and I think I just tweeted that I had arrived at the conference day early, and I was hanging out in the sort of downstairs restaurant. Is anyone keen to hang out? And as luck would have it, you replied, and we chatted. I think a little bit on Twitter. I'd read a few of your blog posts, and kind of knew a little bit about what you were doing. And hop, skip, and a jump, probably half an hour to an hour later, you, me, and Jim Benson were drinking bourbon in a little bar in downtown Austin. And yeah, that
Yeah.
was the start of what led to this.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. And that was a good time. And you had known Jim previously or known of Jim. Was that the first time you met him?
I had actually never met Jim in person. I'd seen him speak once or twice at a conference, and I kind of know him generally through the circles. But we hadn't met. We certainly hadn't drunk whiskey together before. So that was pretty cool as well. Yeah, it was. I remember there was some little whiskey bar, and we ended up. I think the second night we went out, or maybe it was later that same evening. But I think it was the second night we ended up drinking whiskey at another place, and you were telling me all about some of your favorites. And if I remember correctly, they actually happened to have one of the Garrison brothers. They had one of their whiskeys in that place, so that was my first taste of one of your favorites. So that was a cool experience. Yeah,
Proper Texas bourbon.
yeah,
I think we were in the bar of the Driscoll Hotel, which is an old, historic, famous
that
Austin
rings a bell.
landmark.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Oh, that was a good time. I really enjoyed Austin. It is the first time I've actually been inside Texas. I'd flown through a couple of times, but never actually inside. And yeah,
Yeah.
I remember quite a few people telling me that Austin and Texas are slightly different places. But yeah, I got a bit of a taste, so it was nice.
So,
Yeah.
and I don't ask this question in the spirit of you made a bad decision, but why come to Texas to learn about lean and coaching? I mean, it's a huge long trip and a big expense. And I'm just curious. I mean, and the people at Lean Frontiers do great events, including the Lean Coaching Summit. I mean, I was there, so I don't think it was a bad decision, but it's just a couple hours drive down the road for me. But why do that? You know?
So, I mean, there's at least two reasons, and the first one was the invitation. So I actually got a mail from John Shook, who said, I'd done one of his conferences in Barcelona a couple of years before, and he said, we're hosting this thing out Austin side, and I think basically he was saying, I think that your talk would be interesting because you've been talking about some cool stuff. We'd hung out a couple of times. I actually got subbed in for a friend once at a conference. He couldn't make it, and so I was like tagged in at the last minute. We met each other through that, and next thing I think now probably at the Lean Frontiers, I've probably spoken at about 4 or 5 of their conferences, in all in different countries. And so for me, it was mostly an opportunity to sort of pay one back to John because he'd done a couple of cool things for me in the past, and also an opportunity to see a part of the world that I haven't been so much to. I've been privileged to spend a fair amount of time in the US, but never in Texas. And so I thought, yeah, sounds like a great opportunity. I looked at the speaker lineup. There were a bunch of cool people hanging out. I knew there would be plenty of people in the audience, and I'd had great fun at the events in the past. So I did a bit of a turn back via New York and spent some time with my team that side. So it was able to tack it on to a business trip. So it wasn't just in and out for sort of the 2 days. But I will take pre-COVID, I would have taken almost any opportunity to go somewhere cool and interesting and hang out with nice people. So, and I'm very glad I did. So,
well, that was a good time. And when we talk about traveling the world, listeners or viewers may pick up on, maybe it doesn't sound like you're from Stockholm originally.
No, despite the fact that I grew a beard and look slightly more hipster than when I arrived, I'm not originally Swedish. I get a lot of guesses as Australian and New Zealand, but my home is actually Cape Town, South Africa. I'm not born there, but that's where I would be if I wasn't living here. It's a lovely part of the world. But apparently my accent is not very South African, but I think the sort of the Bond villain version of the South African accent is not the same one that I have. So it somehow sounds a bit different.
Well, and I've learned, not through anything too horribly embarrassing, but I've learned not to guess about accents because the opportunity to be wrong is so much greater than the payoff from being right. So especially if you guess that somebody is Scottish and they're actually Welsh, and you just don't want to get into creating any hard feelings over guessing wrong.
Yeah, you can definitely start some trouble. Canadian and American is one that's tricky if you muddle as well. That one always a fine.
Yeah, so I can, and maybe it's a matter of context where I can pick up usually very quickly if somebody is from Canada. Yeah. But I grew up near Detroit where you had a lot of exposure to Canadian television. At least so. But imagine people in different parts of the world may have trouble distinguishing the difference between Australia and New Zealand, or Ireland and Scotland, or it's
definitely an exposure thing, I think.
But I was going to say, speaking of getting into trouble, we raise a glass and go into the segment here where we talk about what we're sipping on and why.
Give it a good solid sniff before we start.
It's not great listening for those on the audio podcast feed.
It's sort of it's an interesting.
That's where maybe the listener is pausing and taking a sip of their own. But I'll let you go first, Cliff. What are you sipping on there?
So I'm sipping on an Amrut Fusion, as it's called, which surprisingly enough is an Indian whiskey. I did not know until this bottle was in my hands that India even made whiskey, and so that was quite a happy discovery. My wife actually bought it for me in duty free, not in duty free actually. It was in a store outside of the duty free, but I think it was in Uganda actually, funnily enough. and arrived home with this whiskey and said, I have no idea if it's going to be any good. I didn't know that India made whiskey. I didn't know that Ugandans sold whiskey, but here it is. And I tasted it, was very impressed, and then found out that Amrut has actually won a bunch of awards.
Right.
And yeah, thus started my journey. I have been quite fascinated to see some more of their stuff, but that's what I have in my glass right now.
Yeah, well, good. I've had that before. There, I'm blanking out on the names. There are a few other whiskeys that I've seen from India, but no, I mean, I think it's amazing to see what's being distilled all around the world. It's not the exclusive domain of Scotland or the U.S. anymore, and you see whiskey pretty much all around the world. Even in countries you wouldn't associate with whiskey. France distills not just cognac and Armagnac, but there are French whiskeys. And I learned France is actually a really big consumer of whiskey. I think secondary to wine.
I wonder if that's, I wonder what causes that, because I kind of think of French as drinking pretty much nothing but wine, and
or maybe distilled wine if you want to go crazy.
Yeah. Somehow that would feel more natural than whiskey, but It's one of my favorite things to do when I go somewhere new, is to find out what do the locals eat and drink, and you find some wonderful things. You find some very surprising flavors and tastes as well. But I love that sort of experiencing it like the locals do kind of vibe, and so
So help refresh my memory. So when I was in Stockholm, I was trying to drink local, and that doesn't mean just whiskey, but it wasn't vodka, but it was a clear liquor that was sort of very cold with like a frozen cranberry.
Frozen cranberry.
What is that called?
So the common Swedish drink, especially around midsummer and like any kind of celebratory thing, would be to drink what you would call a schnapps, but it's aquavit is what you call it in Swedish. It's basically it's quite close to a vodka or a cane. I think it's a distilled whiskey or distilled liquor, but they put a lot of anything from juniper to all kinds of different berries and flavors, a lot of different woods. You get ones with wormwood and different things, so you get very interesting flavors. And the sort of the Swedish tradition is that you pour yourself a shot, you sing a very short sort of 10-15 second song, and then skål, which is cheers, and you knock the shot back, and rather rinse repeat until you're done or the bottle is, and that's basically the plan.
and I remember consuming that with like along the lines of eating local reindeer, which maybe a little bit different in the US. We would call venison, which sounds a bit less like you're ruining Christmas. And
it's
then,
not Rudolph anymore.
No, and then bear. Bear shoulder, in particular, I remember.
Interesting. I've only eaten bear as like a mince or meatball variation. Apparently, there's a very strict. They do culling for sort of population control reasons, but there's very limited licenses for hunting bears, and pretty much all the meat ends up going to the restaurants. It makes sense, I think, that they use the meat for something good. If they were just farming the bears or killing them for no reason, maybe I would feel a bit differently. But it is interesting to try whatever the local variations are.
And maybe we'll look forward to being able to get back to that. We can still import goods, so we can still perhaps drink whiskeys from around the world. And you're drinking whiskey from India. I'm drinking a whiskey from Tennessee, but you're able to get bourbon or American whiskey.
We are sometimes, and actually, as a result of my tweeting requests, I posted a photo a couple of days ago, or yesterday, I think, asking which one I should drink on Twitter. And I found out as a result, a friend messaged me privately, there's actually a way to be able to order pretty much anything you want through because Sweden has an alcohol monopoly that's owned by the state that controls all the liquor sales. It has some pros and cons, but it's, you can actually get them to import pretty much anything you want. You will probably pay quite a pretty penny for it, but yeah, and it can take some time, obviously, I think, especially in current times.
Yeah.
But yeah, I may have to find myself some Garrison Brothers and a few other bits and pieces and stock up on some good bourbons, because yeah, I probably won't be in the US for a little while, unfortunately.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
But so what I'm drinking is from Tennessee, and even though I still love my Texas bourbon, and bourbon is most associated with Kentucky. So what I'm drinking here, and I think there's an interesting story behind it. So it's a Tennessee whiskey, which is a specific designation. Jack Daniel's being the most famous of the Tennessee whiskeys. Would probably legally, technically, also categorize as a bourbon. But Tennessee is known in particular for the charcoal filtering, with that unique process after it's been distilled. And, a little bit of history that had been lost or covered up for a while is going back to the mid-19th century. Jack Daniel's learned whiskey making from a Tennessee slave who was nicknamed Uncle Nearest. And in recent years, and I'll link to a story about all of this history in the show notes. In recent years, for one, Jack Daniel's has actually started acknowledging some of that legacy and history as part of their tour at the Jack Daniel's distillery. And then in recent years, this brand was launched called Uncle Nearest in honor, and it is it's a minority-owned distillery. And it's won some awards. It's and I think there's an interesting story and to think about. You had somebody with this whiskey knowledge who wasn't able to turn that into a business on their own 150 years ago. But so even with some of that sadness around that, it's a delightful whiskey, and I think it's worth honoring that history a little bit.
Very cool. Yeah.
So
cheers to a good story. That's a
good story told badly by me, perhaps, but I'll link to the story instead of reading the packaging and the little booklet that came with it. So back to Twitter, and Jamie Flinchbaugh and I often talk about stories that are in the news or articles we've read. Tweets are a lot easier to digest.
Even you kind of get the headline and the punchline in one go.
Even up to 208. It's 280 characters now, more or less.
I think so, because they doubled it, or they definitely increased it. Yeah,
and the link doesn't count toward that, so we'll call it roughly. Tweets are longer than they used to be, but even with that, I think, and I follow you on Twitter, and you've had a lot of tweets that, as you said, I replied to one of your tweets. I'll bring it up here in a second. And as you said, lots of nuance to explore here. So that's what a podcast is good for, right?
Yeah. I find it interesting because in general, I sort of think of it as tweeting is sort of the headline of something, but there's always something deeper underneath it. And what I find fascinating is you have something that either could be quite a sort of considered thought, or even something that's maybe a little bit more, it's been bouncing around your head, but you're not quite sure how to get it out there. And probably it becomes a blog post or something a little bit longer, or a bigger discussion on a podcast. But what I like about it is you get to put it out into the world, and other people either resonate with it, or they add something, they give some feedback, they explore some nuance. And so I've been really enjoying that process of just kind of kicking the ball around a little bit with other people and seeing, there's certain domains that I know nothing about, where people come from a different lens and share fascinating perspectives, that it kind of rounds out your thinking a bit more. And I really enjoy that process. So
and sometimes it's interesting to see what resonates, and then, like you said, elaborate on that. Once people have expressed interest in a thought. Now, do you have the tweets handy?
I do.
I could tweet. Do you want to start with the Deadwood tweet?
Sure.
I'm changing the sequence that had been sort of planned out, but
it's
your tweet, so we'll hear it in your voice.
Sure. So the tweet is actually, it's a paraphrasing that I only found out afterwards, is actually from Deming. Not surprisingly, that a lot of smart things that come out of other people's mouths are influenced by Deming.
Right.
But the tweet is, if you have Deadwood in your company, there's really only kind of two ways that it got there. Is either you hired Livewood, or either you hired Deadwood or you hired Livewood and killed it. And I use this in several of my talks because I think so much of what we're trying to do is kind of, you're trying to create an organization where people can bring some of their knowledge to bear. And very often you see people departing or leaving a company, usually out of sort of a frustration or becoming dead wood and some unhappiness that arises. And so in exploring some of these topics, I found this tweet really resonates with quite a lot of people. It's, if people are not performing to the level that you expect, it's either something in your environment that creates that situation, or you've just hired the wrong people the first time around. And both of those things are within your control to influence and change. And yeah,
as executives or startup founders or CEOs, what have you. I don't care for, when I see executives somehow playing the victim, like, oh, we're saddled with all of these lousy employees. Well, like, again, how did that come to be? We can ask even a few whys. Well, okay, if that is true, and I would question and challenge if that really is true, is the problem bad people? Is it bad systems? Is it bad culture?
Sure.
That all comes back, as Dr. Deming would have said, that comes back on senior leaders. And, I think if we are taking the live wood and killing it, are we learning anything so that we can prevent that cycle from continuing? Drum out the dead wood, hire in some fresh-faced, enthusiastic people, and then see where they are and what their attitudes are like 5 or 10 or 20 years later, if you've even kept them that long.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of different reasons why people may depart from a company or change their mind about something. But certainly what I've seen is very often, both personally and, I mean, I've probably also guilty of this as a manager in my past as well. It's a hard thing to know how to create a good environment for people to be able to feel like they belong and can perform well and connect to the others around them. And so, yeah, it's a fairly not flippant comment, but it's quite cutting and direct. But it's also, I usually in the talk kind of acknowledge that there's a lot of nuance and sort of complexity behind this. It's not that simple. But if we don't at least acknowledge that we have some responsibility, I like this metaphor of creating culture as a sort of like gardening. You can't tell the plants to grow. You can't set them KPIs and give them motivational speeches. That doesn't work, right? You have to really create an environment. You plant at the right time. You give enough water and enough light, but not too much water or too much light. And that whole thing of creating balance. And each plant is a little bit different. You create the conditions for the plant to grow rather than making the plant grow. And I think that makes a lot more sense, for organizations and working with people.
Yeah. Well, and what you say about different plants being unique, requiring different amounts of light or exposure or water, reminds me of something else Dr. Deming said of, the most important thing for managers is to understand their employees as individuals.
Yes.
That what might be motivating or not demotivating to one person might not apply to somebody else. So, I know, I've worked with a lot of people in healthcare, and I know a lot of nurses and healthcare practitioners. And, it's interesting to see the disconnects between what leaders think counts as recognition and how some of the staff see it. So healthcare is notorious for, sometimes, almost working people to death and then throwing a pizza party. And then the nurses sometimes roll their eyes like, you think a little bit of pizza makes this all okay?
Yeah.
And what about the people who are gluten-free?
Yeah. No. It really does surprise me how often the blame. I mean, I recognize this because I think I probably do the same, but there's sort of a tendency that I recognize to sort of externalize responsibility for something. It's not me that's the problem. It must be those people over there. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, if we can at least acknowledge that we have some responsibility in the situation, I think we can do a little bit more about it. And yeah, as I said, it's still super hard to get right, but you're more likely to get it right if you're at least involving some of your humans in that conversation. And
Mm-hmm.
you know, what is the right environment? Do you even like pizza? You know what? Yeah,
Are you sick of
but
pizza?
amazing.
Because that's what we do every time. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah,
Well, and so
yeah,
you mentioned, I think you kind of transitioned into one of the other tweets that had caught my eye recently related to karma, or at least that's how you started off the tweet.
yeah. I just wanted to open that one quickly here. So yeah, I mean, there's probably a longer story behind this, but maybe too much detail for the topic at hand. But what I said was, I don't believe in karma. I do believe I have very little effect from blaming or ranting. I sometimes tell myself it helps, but usually that's not true either. And when I'm able to, or when I'm not able to reach someone, if I ask why, most of the truthful answers are me and my behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And what was kind of going through my head is that I've seen a lot of times both myself, but in this particular case, I was sort of observing somebody else doing something that I recognize myself having done many times. And so I was sort of reflecting on them doing the thing that I have often done. And you sort of say, well, we're trying to change this organization, but that person won't listen. Senior people don't listen to us coaches about that thing, or whatever it is. And sort of, again, a little bit connected to the previous one, we end up kind of blaming them, which is, I think, a little bit ironic because it works the other way around as well. It's sort of, we're doing the thing we're complaining about, which I find amusing. But yeah, really, I think at its core, the only person that I can directly change through my own sort of immediate influence is me.
Right.
And I don't know. Do you know Esther Derby?
I've heard the name, but I
Yeah.
don't know her. Certainly heard of her, but yeah, tell us more about her.
I found, so I've been on multiple of Esther's workshops and learned some fantastic things from her. One of them was this concept of reframing. And she talks about the power of, if you're familiar with some of the stuff in sort of the topic of growth mindset, the idea of framing something in a neutral or ideally positive sense, even when it is negative. So one of the fantastic examples I heard was this idea of that person is always very commanding and kind of dictatorial in their approach. And she reframed it as they typically only use one form of power.
Mm.
And what I found quite powerful about this was this idea of it clearly opens up some possibility for ways to be able to work with that person, maybe to either reflect that to them, but it's not saying you're wrong. It's simply saying maybe using that form of power is good, but not in all scenarios.
Mm.
And so maybe helping to, how can you explore some other forms of or other ways of interacting? And I think that was a little bit was kind of what was behind my tweet, is if I frame it as actually I'm seeing them as the problem, but they also have their own motivations and their own desires, dreams, and hopes. And I shouldn't negate them by, I just showed up yesterday as a coach, and why should they listen to me? They've been running the company for 25 years,
And that sort of reminds me of, I'm going to have to paraphrase it, but if he passed away a couple years ago, John Perry Barlow from the Electronic Frontier Foundation.
Yeah.
He, was really, really big into internet freedom, and he wrote songs for the Grateful Dead, and he had this very interesting, eclectic life. And but there's a quote from him. I'm going to paraphrase it. I'm butchering it, but basically it was this reminder of, if you disagree with somebody or you think that they're wrong, you're better off assuming that their viewpoint is coming from good intentions, just as your stance is.
Yeah.
And, that might not be true 100% of the time, but I think, let's say in workplace issues,
Sure.
if you're trying to influence people or trying to affect change, like the one thing I think I've learned is that it's not helpful to label somebody as resistant. Like you have to step back and try to better understand their perspective And again, they're probably well-intentioned, externalizing it, as you put it, I think is unhelpful. We can step back and think, friends who used to work at Toyota talk about the culture there of very much internalizing. How did we let the employee down? Like when there's a big quality problem, instead of blaming the problem, leaders thinking about, why didn't we create a system that prevented that from happening, which is more of that sort of internalization, I guess.
What I like about that as well is that it kind of it kind of gives the leaders an opportunity to be able to do something like fairly concrete about it, as opposed to going and just kind of dumping on that person over there. It's like, well, what can I do? Oh, I can actually influence the design of the system, or we can create a sort of better learning capability within the organization. And that's, I think, just kind of pointing over there and then using hope as we hope they will get it right. I don't know. We should probably try to work together to figure things out. I think that, at least in my experience, that often works a lot better.
And I think, there's this journey of figuring out what works better. And maybe I'll use that as a way of trying to segue to one of your other tweets about metrics and KPIs, which is a topic love talking about. And your tweet really caught my eye too.
Cool. Yeah. So I recently found myself having quite a few conversations with folks who were sort of starting out with metrics, and they sort of realized that we don't have so many metrics, and we're not really sure how to tell what's working well and how to kind of prioritize all of them. And usually the response that I found was that people would kind of go out and go from 0 metrics to like 500 metrics.
Right.
And to me, this is weird, because when I don't know something about, like, why would I go and invest in all of the options when I don't know what I'm yet actually needing and what I'm doing? And so I'd been thinking about this for a little while. And what I said was basically, when you're starting out with metrics and KPIs, you should probably consider 3 different questions, which was, if this number, like if we had this number and if it went up, what would we do differently? If it went down, what would we do differently? And given your answers, why do you need that metric? Yeah. And I asked this question in different variations of this to one specific client. And what was interesting was they kind of came up with this, well, actually, we don't know what we would do if it went up or down. And so my question was, well, why do you need that metric? What would it be for? And so what it helped them to do was kind of think through the set of metrics that they have and sort of say, okay, well, we want to introduce all of these. We have some idea and we think there's probably something behind it. But if we can't explain some kind of directional shift or response to any of this data, maybe we don't need those ones and we can focus on some other set. And so I think it helped them to do was sort of reflect a little bit and go, oh, actually, there's only 3 or 4 that we really know what we would do differently, which means we probably need to think about this a bit more, but also maybe those are the first set that we could start gathering, because gathering metrics and data and trying to make sense of them is not a free activity. It costs a lot of time.
I mean, there's that I think that first important question of what should we measure and why, right? We often look at what's easily measurable. And to your point, the fact that something's easily measurable may not really be that meaningful. I think it's interesting to think through, let's say, Eric Ries and the Lean Startup framework around vanity metrics. Some things that are easy to measure may make us feel good, but aren't really the best indicators about predicting growth or future success for the business.
Sure.
Why are we measuring it? Why does that measure matter? Like, I think in terms of health, the little bit I know about, let's say, laboratory testing, there are literally hundreds of things you could measure about your blood and your human system. But we don't do that on a daily basis or even a monthly basis or even on an annual basis. We don't look at all the possible measures, but for each of us, there's a handful of numbers that we probably can and should be looking at and making decisions about our health accordingly.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense. I mean, this thing, getting into the whole metrics topic, there's so much around understanding. I mean, as you said, what's statistically meaningful, because a lot of the time, what happens? I mean, I when I started investing for the first few times, you read some of these fairly, well, let me be careful how I say it, but like some of the blogs and posts that people make out there, like, Apple went up by 1% and that's clearly because of X. And then tomorrow they went down also because of the same X. And I realized quite quickly that mostly nobody has any idea what's actually going on. You can construct a narrative and say, well, this thing happened and this other unrelated thing happened, and we draw some correlation between them because that's what we don't know, we need to tell a story. And in the news case, I guess it's because they get paid for news articles more than accuracy. But it's the same challenge in a business context. You're going to do something with the data. What are you going to do with it? Like, why are you putting that into your system? And if you can't tell what's meaningful, you end up panicking and creating action to try to respond to something that's actually not important. And I think, contrary to what a lot of people think, I actually think that in many cases we have too much action rather than too little. And it's more that it's unguided, and the metrics and KPIs could point us in a more sensible direction and away from pointless directions as well.
Yeah, and that's where I replied to your tweet. We get beyond the point of what do we measure. Then there's that important question of, well, so how and when do we react? So I'd replied, well, if this went up or down, is that change statistically meaningful? Or is it noise in the system? So what you're describing with the stock price, if the stock price is just fluctuating up and down, or the market as a whole, people crave that explanation. The Dow was up 83 points today because of something. And like 83 points is basically nothing. So why would you even bother trying to explain that? But if there's a huge drop that's probably explained by economic uncertainty due to the pandemic, then that might be a meaningful, 1,000-point drop or something significant. And, so when we come back to business metrics, it was one of those lessons I was fortunate to learn early in my career. And I wrote my book, Measures of Success, to try to pass along some of those lessons around, to your point, leaders, or when they're overreacting, or when they're reacting to every up and down. I would call that overreacting. That creates a lot of wasted motion, to use lean language. And people go searching for a root cause that just literally isn't there. And I've got a friend of mine who works in the health system who understands these concepts, and he's still trying to help his leaders understand, because the leaders are still asking for that explanation. Like, that data point looks bad, and a team of people go off to research something that's not going to be found.
Several months later, you're getting a report that cost you several $1 million, for what was essentially a shower thought. Not necessarily, I think it's fascinating because there's so much of that. And like, I've seen this with a couple of companies where you have just enormous amounts of data. And I'm kind of I don't want to say a skeptic of big data, or sort of as a concept, but a lot of the challenge is not so much the data, but trying to make some meaningful sense out of it. And simply knowing that something happened doesn't tell you why or what you could do to influence it. And those are completely different things. I've seen so much effort put into something that turns out, we've made a funky assumption. Oops.
Well, and then there are bad conclusions that get drawn about cause and effect, where a metric gets worse, somebody demands an explanation, or they demand action to make that metric better. The honest answer might be, why did the metric get worse? Well, because of nothing. And then a month later, that metric has magically gotten better, meaning it just fluctuated back in the other direction. And now someone might get praised for, hey, good job, Cliff. You really responded to that in an action-oriented way, and you drove results in your team, and pat on the back better. When the honest answer might be like, well, you waited for it to regress back to the mean.
I think that whole just regression to the mean that's a huge factor. I mean, we see this in so many things. I remember at a previous company, I ended up getting a bonus at one of the companies because of literally blind luck, and we even knew that because I was one of the people who was involved in designing the performance management system or the bonus system. And the previous quarter, when we had actually knocked it out the park, we'd arbitrarily missed one minor sort of shift on a metric, despite having the best quarter we'd ever had, and nobody got a bonus, and everyone was, fairly crusty about that because, well, I was expecting a bunch of money and now I didn't. And then the next time we get a huge bonus because of random noise in the data. NPS is up like 3 times what it was just because. Yeah, I wish that kind of in the education system there was much more kind of basic statistics and sort of forget about like calculus and trigonometry and so on, and teach people compound interest, systems, and basic statistics. I would be like, the world would automatically be a better place. And that's probably a very nerdy thing to say because I'm not sure how many other people would agree with me on this, but yeah, I would love it.
I would love it too. And like you said, it's arithmetic more than it is calculus.
Yeah.
Those numbers. So when we're reacting, maybe I think I found a segue to one other tweet we can talk about here.
Sure.
So when people are reacting to everything and demanding root causes that might not be there, we end up being really busy. And so I think you had an interesting tweet about being busy.
Yeah. So this has been kind of my pet thing for the last probably couple of months, is recognizing both as somebody who talks about focus a lot and tries to teach companies how to do that, but also just observing how often it happens that a problem occurs because of a lack of focus. And I talk to a lot of people, they're like, oh, we're so busy. And one of the things, so my tweet was basically, we're so busy, it's a fancy way of saying we don't know what's important. And I think that's exactly what it is that if sort of the nuance that I would unpack there is not necessarily that we don't know, but we're not actually honoring or respecting what is important. We may know it, but we just refuse to do it, or we don't for whatever reason. And the motivations behind that are complicated. But I think in our modern day, it's become almost a badge of honor to be busy. It's like it's just an expectation. And
I have that exact phrase on the tip of my tongue. Yes, badge of honor. Yeah.
Yeah, and I find it so weird. Like, why would you want to be doing everything mediocre instead of one or two things really well?
Yeah.
It's hard. I mean, like a lot of these things, it's easy to know the theory. It's another thing to put it into practice. But yeah, if you know what's important, you're unlikely to be all over the map, in my experience.
Yeah, and there's the bragging about how busy we are. Executive profiles often, have the, sort of the braggadocious statements about how early they wake up every morning and they're in the gym by 4:15, and some people maybe biologically do not require as much sleep as others. Some of that may be the lottery of life, but there's this idea of effort, sheer effort leads to success. There are, I'm not a particular fan of the methodology, but the counter to that is the idea of who's the author of like the 4-hour work week.
I forget his name as well, but I know the one you're talking about. I've read the book.
But that sort of throws an interesting counterpoint to, wait a minute, if you could focus on the most important things, and find those high leverage points that lead to success for yourself or an organization. But still, I think, I guess that idea stood out because it did fly in the face of working. Elon Musk brags about working 120 hours a week or something like that.
And I think that this is insane. I mean, there is obviously some correlation between, if you don't do anything, you probably won't get any results either. Sure. And sort of that, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. Like that can also be true at the same time as there's a point of diminishing returns where the curve flattens off. And so, maybe cost of delay is perhaps a little bit sort of too deep to go into, but if you look at sort of the payoff function in an option or in sort of a cost of delay world, basically there's usually a very, very small number of things that pay off an enormous amount, and the goal should be to try to find those things, and that doesn't necessarily have to be a monetary sense. It could be, in your own happiness or life sense or whatever impact you're trying to have. But there will be a small handful of things, and that doesn't mean only do 3 things. It just means as soon as you realize that what you're doing isn't actually going to impact one of those 3 things, you have a choice to make. You can continue diluting your effort, or you could focus better. And yeah, I feel like my general journey to the point where I'm at now is actually, I'm not less busy in that I do so much less stuff, but the quantity of things that I'm actually thinking about and working on is smaller. And as a result, those things tend to move further and faster. You can argue whether or not that makes sense, but yeah, there's an element of balance.
Yeah, I mean, I've talked to people who used to work at Tesla, and then there's just what you read in the press where, Elon Musk has this reputation of being, very much a micromanager. Where I read, I think in contrast the other day, an article about Tim Cook at Apple, and it was talking about him knowing where he can make a unique contribution to the company, and that he did not sit in on all the Apple Watch design meetings where Steve Jobs, he was more of the product visionary, and he would have sat in on all of those and obsessed over different details of things. And Tim Cook doesn't go to those meetings. Not that he doesn't care, but at some point, he's got a large global company. If he can't trust people to make decisions, where are they going to be?
I think Tim Cook is actually probably one of the most fascinating people for me at the moment, partly because I'm a bit of an operations nerd, but and so is he. But I think a lot of people put a lot of emphasis, specifically in Apple, on the product vision, and I think that's important. Like, the strategy and the vision is definitely making, like, it is a huge differentiator. But people overlook the operational capability that is needed. I mean, to scale the iPhone to 60, 70 million units a quarter, like, this is ludicrous numbers. And how fast they've done that, and with maintaining the quality and the level of supply chain responsiveness, and it's just absolutely amazing. Like, the operational capability to me is almost more impressive than the end result of the product. And I think people overlook that, because I mean, that's it's not Tim Cook by himself, but he brings a lot of that expertise into that organization, and I don't think they would have been able to be as successful anywhere near what they are now without that. And again, it's 2 sides of a coin. It's not one or the other. You need both.
Yeah, and as an industrial engineer myself and an operations nerd, I look up to Tim Cook as a industrial engineer and somebody who was really helping Apple grow and succeed when Steve Jobs was still with us. And it seems like Tesla, by comparison, does not have a Tim Cook who is strong enough to counteract Elon's tendencies, where they have product vision, and then they have operational execution problems that still plague them to this day. And there are people out there. I mean, I don't know if you've ever fallen into this on Twitter. Here's an experiment tomorrow. Go criticize Elon Musk on Twitter, and sometimes his followers will really will come after you.
I have a group of friends who are very much long on Tesla, and it's not advisable to criticize, because I find it interesting, because I learn a lot of interesting things, because you sort of, there's a Charlie Munger quote that I really like. He says, I try not to hold any opinion I try not to hold any opinion if I don't know the other side's argument better than they do. And I really like that notion. It's for me a very sort of aspirational thing, because I think it's a lot of hard work to really invest in understanding, I think, the depth of somebody else's argument, especially when you think they're just wrong. But that's kind of exactly why you should understand it, because there's probably some nuance inside there. But so I find it interesting from that perspective. But I don't know. My sort of take on Tesla is I find the company fascinating. I think their products are interesting, but I wouldn't put my money on it personally, because that's a different thing. You're betting against everybody else, not against or for Tesla. And I see those as slightly different sort of things. So,
and I think some of the response you get is, if you criticize an aspect of Tesla, then people say, "Oh, you're hoping that they fail." I'm like, "Well, wait a minute. No, I think it's a really important company with a really important mission, and I think criticizing their operational shortcomings is part of like, man, I hope they fix that, so that they can succeed. If they had been willing and able to learn more from Toyota, when Toyota was willing to help them, they could have been more like an Apple, or if you look at the history of Intel, Intel was not just about product innovation; it was about operational excellence.
Exactly.
And those two going hand in hand.
Yeah. I find it fascinating how many companies talk about that, and they even hire somebody to head up operational excellence, or they have these centers of excellence and all of this sort of stuff. But when you look around, it's like you sort of wonder how much of this is actually excellent. Putting the coat of paint on it and calling it the thing doesn't necessarily make it the thing. And in fact, I usually find there's a bit of an inverse correlation. If you have to tell us how great your product is, it's probably not that great. It kind of would sell itself,
Right.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's interesting. There's so many things inside there that, yeah. But the short version is the operational capability is massively, massively overlooked, I think. And I was talking about something earlier today, actually, this idea that strategy and operations are somehow sort of seen as separate domains. We often even will have a chief strategy officer, chief operations, or something like this.
Right.
And it's not that I think that necessarily has to be the same person in every company, but to do strategy well, you need to know some things about operations, and to do operations well, you need to know some things about strategy. And if you make a strategy in absence of the operational understanding of what the business can actually do, and it's just going to be weird. Like it will be incoherent with reality, and vice versa. Why would you build operational capability for something that's not in the strategy? Those two things need to be coherent with each other, I think. So
I had an opportunity to interview Tom Peters recently for my lead podcast. And he said something to the effect in one of his papers he published. Execution is that pesky final 95% of what you need to do to be successful after this. And people put so much emphasis on strategy. And he was thinking, well, okay, strategy goes maybe that 5%. Execution, of course, matters greatly. But
I think that's
schools, and I say this, I have an MBA, but the sexy thing is to, people want to go get a job in strategy more so than I was in a program with people who wanted a career in operations, and we were by far the minority at MIT. But,
I don't think that it's. I think that's the part of the challenge is that a lot of the time those things are taught as if they're separate things. And people sort of specialize in one or the other. And I'm quite a strong proponent of having more generalists and specialists only in very unique and specific cases. And as a specialist, it's a good idea to be aware of the general things that you probably won't be exposed to because you went super deep on one or two things. Very useful in the right place, but overused, it doesn't make so much sense, It's a little bit like using a hammer for the same problem, or,
Yeah. So as we kind of start to wrap up here, you mentioned earlier that you had worked for Spotify. I didn't really give you a chance to talk about what it is you're doing now. So maybe you can tell the listeners what you're doing now, what types of things you're doing, and the company, things like that.
Now that I've had a whiskey, I'll give a more interesting explanation, perhaps. But yeah, I was leading a team of coaches at Spotify. That was a fascinating journey. When we started out, or when I joined the company, we were just shy of 700 people. 4.5 years later, we were 5,000, which is ludicrously fast growth. I think it was 10 million customers to around 210 million customers in the same time frame, which is also insane. And I find a lot of things about Spotify quite fascinating, but what it kind of led me to is this thing about partly about the operational capability and the integration that has with strategy. And that's what my focus is on now. And so most of my energy is going into an organization called the Flight Levels Academy. And what we do is we focus on teaching people how to understand what their operational capacity and capability actually is by connecting the various, I say levels, but there's nuance on this, is that if you think about an organization as kind of, there's three rough sort of groups of levels. Operations, where the work actually happens. At the top, you have the strategy, where kind of the direction is set and where you can really assess sort of competitive outcomes and marketplace changes, that kind of thing. And often what I find is so often missing, especially in the companies that I've worked with, maybe this is different in others, is that it's kind of the coordination between the different parts of the organization. So we have these silos, or we have different services, but actually integrating those things is very, very complicated. And so we end up, if you're familiar, I think, with Conway's law, it just says that basically what happens is a business tends to design products and services that mirror its internal communication structure. And so if two departments don't talk, or two teams don't talk, it's unlikely that their products and services will be integrated. And so what we try to do is sort of be a little bit of an antidote to that problem by helping people to say, well, what parts of the organization do actually need to connect to create customer value? And so the modern thing is we focus on agile teams, and we say, well, this team needs to be agile and fast, that team needs to be agile and fast, and this other next team needs to be agile and fast. But the reality is that we have an 8 to 12 week backlog between each of the teams. And so customer value kind of goes, well, somebody came up with an idea, this team took 2 weeks to sprint through it, and then it waits 8 to 12 weeks for the next team to start, and so on and so on and so on. And that's before you start looking at marketing, finance, the budgeting process, the whole planning cycle, and so on. Very quickly, you end up with several years worth of lead time. And the solution to this is not to try to make the team fast, because that's only a fraction of it. Try to coordinate the organization around one or two things of focus. So, if this whiskey is the most important thing, let's put as much focus onto this whiskey and not so much focus onto everything else, because then this whiskey will get finished faster. And so, we need to be able to visualize and understand what's going in our organization operationally, so that we can see how it connects to the strategy. That's kind of my focus. We do a bunch of different workshops and teaching, work with different clients. We have a community of folks who are practitioners. And I think what I like specifically about it is we kind of frame it as, we don't have all of the answers. We often joke about it as, this is our current state of misunderstanding, which I really like. It's, we know there's some things we don't know, and we're open to learning. And I think that curiosity is such a fundamentally important thing, because if you stop wanting to learn, or you think you know it all, that's usually when something comes and bites you in the ear. And at that point, you've kind of lost the game. So, yeah.
So if people want to learn more, where can they find you on the web?
Yeah. The best way to find me personally is to find me on Twitter, Cliff Hazell, at Cliff Hazell. And if you're interested in the Academy, there's two things that I can say. One is flightlevels.io, www.flightlevels.io is the website address. And we also, every 2 weeks, we host actually something a little bit similar to this sort of a session. It's live streamed. It's called Flight Club. You can find it on YouTube and Meetup. So that's Flight Club.
But I thought the first rule would be you don't talk about Flight Club.
The first rule of Flight Club is that you always talk about Flight Club. So yeah, because we're not quite like the fantastic book and movie. We're trying to promote the ideas, and so what we're doing is basically bringing different guests and folks onto the show. We chat to them a little bit, talk about their experiences, their ideas. Everything from practitioners to authors to folks doing cool stuff in the industry. And so, yeah, maybe one day we'll have you as a guest, and we could make it a special Flight Club with whiskey edition or something like that. Could be interesting.
I mean, even without whiskey is fine.
We'll have to find a better time in the day for you if we're going to do it with whiskey, I guess. Yeah. So that's what I've been up to.
All right. Well, cool. Well, I hope people will go follow you on Twitter and go check that out. Flightlevels.io.
That's the one.
I'm sorry?
That's the one.
That's the one. Maybe it's just as a closing fun question. We kind of alluded earlier, we both enjoy the chances to travel internationally and to learn and be exposed to different people and things to eat and drink and learn. What's the first place you'd want to go travel when we can safely do that again?
This is always such a tricky question. The prioritizing where to go next kind of thing. So I had originally planned in June to be in Brazil. I was going to be in Sao Paulo for a conference, and we were going to tour a little bit around in South America. And that's been incredibly high on my list. I have a lot of really wonderful people that I know from there. My wife has spent some time there, and every time she goes, she comes back with something cool and tons of amazing photos and awesome memories. And I really, really want to go. So I think probably I would like to see Sao Paulo, and then kind of tour around a little bit within Brazil and South America. Very high on my list is to see the Iguazu Falls.
Mm-hmm.
I like waterfalls quite a lot. I'm not quite sure why, but there's something calming and peaceful, and just the sheer power of nature. But
Right.
yeah, I think that would probably be my list.
Yeah, I was supposed to back in May go to Brazil. It would have been my second trip ever.
Yeah.
Second trip within a year would have been down to Porto Alegre. There's an opportunity to go do some teaching. So hopefully in 2021. I mean, I guess, yeah, if you want to travel, back to your tweet, if you want to go everywhere, then you don't really know where
Sure.
you want to go.
Yeah.
All right. I guess, well, so this is, I guess we'll tie back to, it was a trip that we're just now in the process of canceling or postponing, but we were supposed to have a family trip to France in October. So hopefully we'll get to do that in 2021.
Yeah, that'd be nice. It's so hard to plan and know what's coming with the current times, but yeah, I think I mean I was traveling so much last year. It was insane. I think I had almost 100 and something flights last year, which that's the consulting life. It has pros and it has cons, but I find myself sort of reevaluating a little bit of this, and I could see myself kind of still traveling quite frequently, but more for longer periods than 2 days or a day kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I like the idea of go to France and spend a week or two and sort of immerse yourself in the experience, and if you can even stay a bit longer, and there's plenty of wine for several weeks of holiday,
and
even some whiskey, as I learned today.
Yes, that will be a wine focused trip, so maybe I'll do a wine focused episode. Jamie Flinchbaugh likes wine too, so maybe we'll mix it up and we'll do a wine episode.
That would be cool
at some point. Or I have a whiskey aged in French wine barrels, so we can combine those worlds.
That sounds very good. Yeah, it's making me thirsty.
Yeah. Well, Cliff, thank you for spending your Saturday night.
Sure.
You are an operations nerd if you're willing to do a podcast and talk about things like this on a Saturday night. So thank you for that.
Of course. Yeah. It's been lovely. It's mostly been a great opportunity just to catch up with you and drink another whiskey together. And I've really enjoyed it. So thank you so much.
Yeah, so have I. Thank you. So I want to thank everyone for listening. You can find all past episodes at leanwhiskey.com. You can find us on, I'll mention first, Spotify podcasts, Apple Podcasts, any place you may find podcasts. I ask you to please rate, review, and subscribe. So Cliff, again, thank you. It's great seeing you again. Cheers. I hope we'll see you in Texas again someday.
Indeed. I look forward to it.
All right. Thanks.
Cheers.
Cheers.